Hello and welcome to this video. On this video we're going to be looking at my 10 favourite live classic rock albums. Right, so before we get started, what do I mean by classic rock? Because I did a video, I think last week, on my sort of 10 greatest classic rock albums. By classic rock I mean the stuff that we used to call heavy rock. You know, when I first came into music in the early 80s, we used to call a certain group of bands heavy rock, and that was like Led Zeppelin, ACDC, Black Sabbath. It didn't really include The Who, it didn't really include the Rolling Stones, it definitely didn't include Yes and Genesis or the Mahavishnu Orchestra. It was a certain thing. Back then we used to call a lot of these bands heavy metal. Of course nobody would ever call them heavy metal. I think the classic rock bands are the heavy rock bands that sort of, or hard rock is another name for it, that came through the 70s. So a lot of these choices come from the 1970s. I've always had mixed feelings about live albums. I think I like to hear the artistic statement of a studio album. But there's a number of things that we can get from a live album. One of those things is that when you've got a fantastic band, you get to hear the band actually play. You get to hear the band stretch out. So in many of these choices, that's what we're hearing. A lot of these classic rock 70s bands really could play. You know, it's different today, where bands just stand up and replicate the album, and that's the job they need to do. Back then, these people would stretch out and do something different. So that makes that's one of the reasons why I've chosen a lot of these albums. Also, in some cases, people made definitive statements. Right, especially classic rock bands. Some of their greatest albums are live albums, and in some cases we would say their greatest album is a live album. And in very rare cases we have albums that we just perceive as albums and just happen to be live. And I think there's one on this list which definitely, if not a few more, that definitely fall into that category. Anyway, I have rambled on too long. I'm going to kick off. So at number 10 we have No Sleep Till Hammersmith by Motorhead. Right? Motorhead's the reason I'm here. You know, when I heard Motorhead in the late 70s, early 80s, it completely changed my life. Motorhead emerged, of course, in Lemmy Kilmister's band, who had previously played with Hawkwind. They emerged around about 1975 and reached a series of albums. By 1980, they are at the peak of their success, especially here in the UK, where they're having massive hit records and massive hit albums. In 1980 they released Ace of Spades, and this put them into superstardom, at least here in the UK, with you know, top of the charts album, top of the charts single. After that they then they did an EP with Girls' School, which also was a huge hit. In fact, yes, I still have my copy here. There it is. There's my Motorhead Girls' School single, the St. Valentine's Day Master. This came out in 1981, and then once they'd released that, they went for a little bit of a jaunt around the UK, I think, around about March 1981, and that came out as a live album called No Sleep Till Hammersmith. That album came out, it went to the top of the charts here in the UK. They released a single off it, which I think was Motorhead. That charted here in the UK. So what we have here with this live album is Motorhead at the peak of their powers, with the classic lineup of Fast Eddie and Filthy Animal Taylor. Just they're at the peak of their game. Motorhead are a dirty rock and roll band, and you get to hear them live on this album, and you get to hear a sort of best of everything they've done up until that point, which is classic, you know, Motorhead. You know, so we get Ace of Spades, and we get, you know, Motorhead, and we get Overkill, and we get Bomb, and we get all those played blisteringly and burningly live. You know, it's an absolute classic album. For me personally, and this list is very, very personal, it really represents an era when I discovered rock music and I was getting into music really heavily and learned the drums. So that's why we got it at number 10, is No Sleep Till Hammersmith by Motorhead. Right, at number 9 I have Live and Dangerous by Thin Lizzy. This is a really fantastic album, and this is one of those albums that really defines the band. Okay, Thin Lizzy start off as a sort of Irishy, folky blues band with Eric Bell on guitar. And then after a number of albums, they changed their sound. You know, we get Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson, we get that twin guitar attack, and they start to release a number of albums that are much more commercial sounding, much more hard rock sounding. There's some really classic albums there, but there's nothing that stands out for me as being the album, the classic album. Perhaps Jailbreak, Black Rose. There's a whole. I mean, I really loved Thunder and Lightning. That was one of my favourite Thin Lizzy albums. But the whole sound and ethos of the band are encapsulated on Live and Dangerous, which captures all the best songs now, right? There's a contentious thing about this album because the question is how much is this actually live? It's been much debated. Tony Visconti, who produced the album, has said that only the drums and the audience noise are actually from the concerts and everything was overdubbed after. Well, does that sound terrible? Well, listening to the album, it doesn't sound like that. There's too much Phil Lynott interjections with the audience that's down to town like they could have been replicated in a studio afterwards. They did go to a studio in Paris and do lots of overdubs on this. So we're not listening to a 100% full live album. But I think it's a great album because it's the best representation of Thin Lizzy, one of the great bands. If you want to go and buy one album by Thin Lizzy, you go and buy this album. I think Brian Downey is one of the greatest of the classic rock drummers. And if that's the only thing underpinning this album, it still gives it an energy and aliveness that is quite infectious. I love this album, and every time I put it on, it's got all the best songs on. It's got all the riffs. Everything on it is great to me, and it sounds live to me. So they did a brilliant job. And nowadays, if you listen to live albums now with computers, this has become the standard way of making albums. I've made albums where live albums where stuff has been overdubbed afterwards, you know, either because things haven't been recorded properly or people make mistakes. In rock music now, the computers are basically playing the music, you know, and everyone accepts this. But you go back to a more purer time, and people find it difficult to think that a band like Thin Lizzy would go in and fix mistakes, you know. Although I think they probably did it because of the actual sound quality. It's very hard to record a band live. It's a very difficult technical thing. Anyway, however you see it, I've tried to explain it. You see, I haven't come down one side or the other. I'm going to gloss over it now and move on. But I think it's a great album. It's not a representation of the band stretching out live and doing all that stuff, but as a sort of best of that band captured with a ton of energy, it's an absolute classic album. So I've got that number 9, Live and Dangerous. Right, the next album is the complete opposite. At number 8, I have On Stage by Rainbow. When Richie Blackmore left Deep Purple in '74, he put together one of the greatest rock bands of all time. Not straight away, the lineup took a time to coalesce, and that classic lineup coalesces around the album Rising, which I think is one of the greatest rock albums ever made. That lineup would be Cozy Powell on drums, Jimmy Payne on bass, Tony Carey on keyboards, Ronnie James Dio on vocals. This is an incredible band. This made a number of classic rock albums in the 70s before Dio departed to go to Black Sabbath, and they brought in Graham Bonnet, and Rainbow changes, and it changes much more into sort of American style hit records band, one of the best ever. And then Jolene Turner comes in and they carry on in that vein. So we have this little pocket in the 70s where we've got this classic rock band, and they're an incredible band. When you buy On Stage, what you get is a chance to hear that band stretching out, and God, do they stretch out. They stretch out in much the same way Deep Purple did live, with really extended soloings, blues jams, all sorts of stuff. But for me, when I put this album on, it's absolutely astonishing. And what really makes it astonishing is Ronnie James Dio's incredible vocal performance. This is a live album. Listen to, there's not one note dropped. It's so powerful all the way through. He's absolutely incredible on this album. It could be the greatest live rock vocal performance in history. Cozy Powell, who's one of my favourite drummers, and I rate in the same area as John Bonham or Ian Pace. is absolutely thunderous. The band's fantastic. Tony Carey, what a keyboard player. We all love that keyboard intro of Taro Woman. Why do they never play that track live? And here, he really stretches out. There's some incredible duets between him and Ritchie Blackmore. It's a fantastic album. Why have I got it so low then at number 8? Why doesn't it beat the other ones? It's the track list. Where's Stargazer? You know, we get like, you know, hours of Mistreated, which is fantastic, but it's nothing I haven't heard on a million albums before. There's a million other Deep Purple albums that we could go and hear them do Mistreated. There is an album that's come out since, which I think is simply called Rainbow Live in Germany from 1976, where they do a version of Stargazer. For me, I grew up, and it nearly made this list, I grew up with a compilation album that came out in 1981, which was a live recording of the Castle Donington Monsters of Rock show from 1981, which had 2 rainbow tracks, including Stargazer, with Graham Bonnet singing, and that's incredible, you know. But I think if it had Stargazer on, and a few more tracks from Rainbow Rising, perhaps, this album would be a lot higher up the list. I think it is great to hear some of the tracks off Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, because as much as I love that album, the lineup's not quite there, and they're a bit wimpy, and it's nice to hear some of those tracks like Man on a Silver Mountain, you know, done by this lineup. So yeah, but that's the only reason I marked it down. There's no Stargazer. It's got Stargazer on it. It might have been near the top of this list. So what have I got at number 7? Right, I didn't know whether to put this album on. I didn't know whether to put it up high or low. Right, it is the album that is sat behind my head. The song remains the same by Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin are supposedly this incredible live band. I don't agree. I think they were incredible in the studio. I think Jimmy Page was a genius in the studio, and he knew how to make these incredible statements. Live, the band were much more experimental, and they stretched out. One of the bands that sort of invents stretching out in the classic rock genre. Some of that stretching out isn't as successful as other bands when they do it. That is my opinion on that. Song Remains the Same is a little bit of a mess, because again, it was recorded over 3 nights for a film, and I think there's been not necessarily as much manipulation as went on Live and Dangerous, but it doesn't sound like a Led Zeppelin bootleg. We didn't get that until How the West Was Won came out. But in terms of a representation of perhaps the greatest classic rock band of all time, it is not terrible. In most cases, it's brilliant. It's just flawed. Right, let's have a look. Let's see if I can tell you what I mean. So, side 1, Rock and Roll Celebration Day, Song Remains the Same, Rain Song. Where's Immigrant Song? Where's Heartbreaker? Where's Black Dog? We don't get those tracks. You know, I can remember when I bought this album, I wanted those to be on. They weren't. Rock and Roll, great, yeah, Celebration Day. It's not their most meatiest stuff, but that's great. Side 2, Dazed and Confused, absolutely incredible. Really, really incredible. And I think Jimmy Page just excels on that. Side 3, No Quarter, fantastic, absolutely brilliant. Again, they stretch out. In fact, the live No Quarter has a little bit more bite than Houses of the Holy. Stairway to Heaven, I don't need it. I've got the studio version. It's a live version of Stairway to Heaven. Right, side 4, Moby Dick. I play drums. I don't want to hear it. I have never got this. I love John Bonham, but is Moby Dick a great drum solo? No, it just goes on and on. The riff at the beginning's great. So I have found that a little bit tedious. Whole Lot of Love, it is fantastic on here, and you hear Zeppelin really stretch out, and you know Jimmy Page does the whole theremin thing. So on the whole, this is pretty magnificent, and it's slightly flawed, which drops it down for me to number 7 on my list. Number 7 it's the 7th. I've said it's the 7th greatest, you know, classic rock live album of all time. So what more do you want? But that's what drops it down to me. Wouldn't it be fantastic to have that definitive live Led Zepp album, which I think they tried to do with How the West Was Won. But again, when I got that and listened to it, a lot of meandering jamming. I don't think they I don't think they're in quite the same league as, say, when you listen to Rainbow jamming live, where that band just sounds on fire and they never seem to miss out. I'm probably going to upset everybody here, but this is why you come to see my opinions, isn't it? If you want my opinions, watch the video. If you don't, then don't watch the video. This is my opinions. I love Led Zeppelin, right? I'm just not too keen on that album. I'm not too keen on How the West Was Won. I like the BBC sessions, but it's not that representative. They never produced an album that really represents who they are live. That's what I think about Led Zeppelin. It's not a testament to them being bad. It's a testament to the fact that their greatness was never quite met by a live album. Are you all happy now? Can I move on to number 6? Number 6, I've got a band who really represented themselves live on this album, and it is Free, live by Free. I really love Free, you know, and I think my inclusion on the greatest classic rock albums, a lot of people went, "Oh, great, you mentioned Free," because they don't seem to get mentioned. You know, they are one of the great bands. This is an organic, funky, soulful rock band, and what we hear with Free live is that captured, right? And I think I love about it is that a track like All Right Now that I've heard many times, as have you, and as much as I love Free, I don't get that much out of hearing that anymore. But then when I hear it on Free live, the way they just bend it and shape it and just push it into something else brings it all alive to me. You know, the Mr. Big section and all that stretching out is absolutely fantastic. I think it's a little bit echoey and reverby as a live album, and it would have been nice to hear that tight sound. But it's a live album, isn't it? It's capturing them in a venue. This is probably what they sound like live, so that's an unfair criticism. But I'll just throw that in as a sort of one of the things I sort of felt about it when I was younger. So yeah, at number 6, I have Free live. Right, what we got at number 5? Live in the Heart of the City by Whitesnake. Right, this was a definitive album for me growing up. Whitesnake is the other Deep Purple spin-off band. It ended up with Ian Pace, John Lord and David Coverdale in the band. They're all in this band by the time we get to this point in their career. They're going to make some absolutely classic rock albums. You know, Ready and Willing and Come and Get It are just 2 of my favourite albums. It's out of shot here, but I've actually got my original copy here of Come and Get It. Right, this is one of my favourite rock albums of all time, partly because I bought it when I was at that point in my life where I was just discovering music. I think Live in the Heart of the City was probably the first live double album I ever bought. They play absolutely brilliant on it, and it captures sort of early-ish Whitesnake right up until the sort of Ready and Willing lineup. So there's different things going on there. The early Whitesnake was even more R&B and bluesy, and there's a little bit of that, and then there's more of the riffing going on. They really stretch out, and I used to absolutely love, you know, the extended version of Ready and Willing, which I think is greater than the album version. So that's what I've got at number 5, Live in the Heart of the City by Whitesnake. I did end up doing a session at Radio 2 for Paul Jones Blues Show when I was playing with Ian Parker, and I managed to, on that session was Bernie Marsden, and I managed to grab him and tell him I absolutely love that album, and I think he told me, yeah, he gets told that all the time. I'm sure me mentioning this album, there's going to be many people going, this is one of my favourite albums. So we need to show some love to Live in the Heart of the City. What have I got at number 4? Right, we're getting down to really 4 classic rock albums. This is the meat and potatoes of this. Right, any of these could be at number 1, believe me. These are really, really important albums. So at number 4, I have Made in Japan by Deep Purple. What can we say about this album? This is one of those defining albums. I think for many Deep Purple fans, this is the album that defines Deep Purple. Yeah, you've got Machine Head, you've got like Deep Purple in rock, but if you were just going to have one album by Deep Purple, it would be Machine Head. Sorry, it would be Made in Japan, wouldn't it? Which was never intended to be a proper release. It was going to be a release and a special release in Japan, and the reason why they put it out is because what they captured was lightning in a bottle. I think that's what happened there. I think Deep Purple, much more than Led Zeppelin, are the Players classic rock band. They're the band that could really stretch out and improvise and extend stuff beyond just that sort of blues rock extension that Cream had done. And I think that's what makes Deep Purple really important. They're just an incredible band. They're at the peak of their powers in 1973. Someone, thinks to record one of the gigs, and what they record is absolutely pure gold. I don't think it's that incredible, because if you check out some of the other recordings of Deep Purple at that time, it's all pure gold. My favourite Deep Purple album was an album of concerts that had been played on radio on BBC, and it was called Deep Purple Live in Concert, and they stretch out even more on that album, and that's an absolutely credible album. And when I was younger, I used to listen to Made in Japan and go, yeah, but I know this is the classic album, but this Deep Purple in Concert album is brilliant. I had a later album with, I think, which was called Live in London as well. That was incredible. I think listening to Deep Purple, it was the live stuff that I listened to first. That's quite rare for me. When I was playing with Robert Plant, I did a Cambridge Folk Festival. When I went backstage, Roger Glover was sat there, and I sat down to him, and what I talked about was this album, and he said, yeah, it was not recorded, going to be released properly. It was just going to be a Japan only release where they had a good following there, so they decided to record a live album in Japan for that market, and then when they heard it back, it was mind-blowing. So that's what I've got at number 3. At number 4, Made in Japan by Deep Purple. Right, number 3, another album that defines this band, and this band do not get enough love. This is one of the greatest late 70s classic rock bands of all time, one of my favourite classic rock bands of all time, and such an important band for setting up, along I think with Judas Priest, the sound that was going to become the new wave of British heavy metal. And this is of course UFO with their live double album Strangers in the Night. I find UFO, and they're just such a good rock band. Incredible riffs, brilliant songwriting, and with Michael Schenker, one of the greatest rock guitarists of all time. They made a whole sequence of really great albums. Those of you who only know UFO from the sort of classic rock stuff they did in the late 70s, go and have a listen to the first 2 UFO albums, which are sort of psychedelic, proggy, acid rock jams. Really not what you expect from UFO. On this channel, every now and then, when I'm talking about progressive rock, people will mention the first 2 UFO albums. So there's obviously a following for those two albums. When I discovered that they existed, I was like, oh my god, UFO did some prog albums. I went and listened to them, and I thought they were terrible. Actually terrible. Like just directionless, jammy, badly recorded albums. And I felt that UFO, they hit their stride when Schenker joined. Schenker's so important to that band. And there's some fantastic albums, but for me, the greatest UFO album is Strangers in the Night. All the tracks on there, they're the definitive versions. And the thing that puts it into the stratosphere for me is Rock Bottom. And for all my friends, I used to go around to people's houses when I was very young, and we would put on Rock Bottom and just sit there with our mouths opened. I have a student called Alex who's really into classic rock and classic rock guitar, and I saw him on Thursday, and he was in the lesson, and while I was chatting, I said, have you heard Rock Bottom? He said, no, I've never heard it. I've never really listened to UFO. And I put it on for him, and then in about 4 minutes in, he gave me a knowing look. Yeah, this is incredible. Schenker's just off the charts, redefining what rock guitar is, and it's that sort of modal, jam. UFO come across as a sort of really gutsy rock and roll band, but on Rock Bottom, they just stretch out. It's almost like jazz fusion. So yeah, that's what I've got at number 3, Strangers in the Night. It's an essential album for anybody who likes rock music, and it's the essential UFO album, and that's why it comes up so high. It's just perfect all the way through. It's a monumental album. So what I have at number 2. At number 2, I have If You Want Blood by ACDC. Right? I don't know how much I can explain how great ACDC are. They stand alone in the world of rock. They define something which seems so straightforward and simple, but is actually so complex. It's like the nuclear physics of classic rock. 3 chords, a groove, and some down-to-earth, throaty, growly, screamy lyrics. That's what ACDC is. They haven't changed that formula. They've never gone off and made a progressive rock album or done a disco album. They just do the same thing, but within that really narrow framework, they seem to be able to do absolutely everything, and they earn it. When you listen to the first Australian-only release albums, like High Voltage, it's not quite there. They're a gutsy, bluesy rock and roll band. By Let There Be Rock, they forged something which is really interesting, no one else is doing. It really is Chuck Berry. It's Chuck Berry expanded into something that is way beyond even rock music. I find them an astonishing band. Once you get to Let There Be Rock, Power Age, Highway to Hell, Back in Black, they are on a run. They're almost like the greatest rock band in the world. And at that point, they do a live album. And I don't think this live album gets mentioned enough. For me, it's on the same level as a Highway to Hell or a Power Age, because it captures them live, and they are a live band. And whereas I always feel like when I'm listening to a live rock album, that because it's recorded live and it's a bit scrappy, it's not like listening to a studio album. ACDC aren't like that. Listening to their live album, it's just a smack in the face, exactly like their studio albums, except that we get to hear Angus Young stretch out, and Angus Young is one of the greatest rock guitarists of all time. He just never drops a note. He never goes wrong. He's always burning. He's better than Eric Clapton for me. He's on the same level as Hendrix for me. He is one of the greatest. God, we should be, revering this band as one of the great bands of all time. So that's what I've got at number 2, is If You Want Blood. So what do I have at number 1? At number 1, I have an album which, it's interesting because I've tried, as I've said on the classic studio albums video I did, I've tried to keep all these albums in the 70s, because that's my definition of classic rock. If we go into the 80s, we get into the new wave of British heavy metal, or thrash metal, or prog metal, or rap metal, and all that type of stuff. All these extra genres that crept in. But I wanted to keep this, is really defined as classic rock. This album is the earliest of all the albums on the list. It was recorded on the 1st of January 1970. That might give you a clue what album this is. And on that album, this guy is inventing jazz fusion and at the same time inventing funk rock and a whole bunch of other rocks, I think, as well. It is the album Band of Gypsies by Jimi Hendrix. If you were to ask me what my favourite Hendrix album is, I think my gut feeling would always be Band of Gypsies. Even though Jimmy was such a genius in the studio and redefined how you use the studio, this band's a different deal. This is a gutsy, funky, jazzy band. And it does 2 things on this album. One is it really defines funk rock. It's somewhere between funk and it's somewhere between rock. There's no Red Hot Chili Peppers or Fishbone or even Faith No More or all those bands that came out, And how much did this influence bands like Aerosmith, who's got that sort of little dirty, funky sound in there? He really does something on here that's important. But also on Machine Gun, that solo, right? That is what all the jazz fusion musicians in the 70s were trying to achieve. Hendrix did it there greater than Miles did on Bitches Brew or the other experimental, until the Mavish Orchestra comes in. That is the defining moment of jazz fusion. This is an important album, and what's interesting, when I put it on, I don't even notice it's a live album. It's just a great album. That is the one album on this list where I think the fact it is live seems to be a detail. Anyway, so that there is my top 10 favourite live classic rock albums. I hope you enjoyed the video. I am going to be looking at a whole host of different live albums this week. This is live album week, so I'm going to now do a video because I've just filmed this. It's the first one I've done. I'm now going to do the 10 greatest live prog albums and the 10 greatest live jazz fusion albums, and that should keep everybody happy, and that's all I want to do, is keep you all happy. Okay, that's all I'm here to do. You know, so talk about music, get you fired up and make you want to listen to the albums. That's all. So I hope you have enjoyed that. I'm sure everybody's now going to tell me all the albums I got wrong and what should have got to be listed. I'm sure somehow I should have mentioned Uriah Heep. Anyway, I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.